Welcome back to the deep end. Today, I want you to just close your eyes for a second. Imagine two sounds.
Mm.
In your left ear, there is a clock. And I don't mean a little digital watch. I mean a massive, ancient clockwork mechanism.
Okay.
You can hear the gears grinding against gears, the pendulum swinging with this absolute mathematical ruthlessness. Tick-tock.
It doesn't get tired.
Never. It never speeds up. It never slows down. It represents the laws of physics, gravity, the orbits of planets, the inescapable hard architecture of reality itself.
And in your right ear, imagine a rushing stream. It's chaotic. It's alive.
The lead.
Completely fluid. It wraps around obstacles. It carves new paths. That represents the human spirit, the self, the ego, that little voice inside that says, I.
And the tension between that ticking clock and that rushing water, that's what we were wrestling with today.
It's a huge tension.
It's haunted humanity since we first developed consciousness. The question is, well, it's simple, but the answer is kind of terrifying. Is that self, that chaotic rushing water, a mistake? Is it a prison we need to escape from?
Or is it a fortress we're supposed to build?
That is the central question of this deep dive, the architecture of the self.
It's a fundamental question.
Yeah.
And usually when we get into this topic, you get a lot of vague platitudes. But the stack of papers we're looking at today is what's aggressive.
It really is.
We're diving into a collection of writings, primarily excerpts from the Quranic path to self-liberation, and some essays on the concept of denying the self. And I have to warn you, and everyone listening, this material is not a gentle meditation guide.
No, it's an intellectual sledgehammer. I noticed that.
It really is.
I sat down with this expecting the usual let go of your ego, find your zen kind of vibe. The standard spiritual trope where the whole goal is to convince yourself you don't actually exist.
Right, to dissolve.
But this source material, it looks at that entire idea and basically says that is a pathology. It identifies two opposing forces in human history: the hermit's silence and prophetic momentum.
Prophetic momentum. That's the key phrase right there. We are looking at a collision, really, between two completely different worldviews.
A total collision.
One view says the world is a trap, the body is a cage, and, the only winning move is to stop playing the game.
Just check out.
The other view, and this is the one the source argues for, says, no, the game is real. The stakes are cosmic, and you are given this self not to destroy it, but to engineer it.
Engineer it. I love that word. It implies there's a blueprint.
There is a blueprint.
So let's set the ground rules for today.
Uh-huh.
I'm stepping into the shoes of the empiricist. I'm looking at the physical evidence this source presents. And what really struck me is how much this text talks about mountains, biology, planetary orbits, the physics of nature.
It's everywhere in the text.
It treats the universe like a laboratory, not some mysterious temple.
And I'll be taking the role of the rationalist. I'm interested in the logical architecture here. The source material spends a huge amount of time deconstructing what it calls shackles, man-made hearsay, superstition, illogical beliefs, and contrasting them with the pure logic of the divine writ.
Okay.
My job is to trace the argument from that state of psychological paralysis the text calls fear and grief, all the way to the destination it promises.
Which is?
Supreme triumph.
Supreme triumph. It sounds lofty. But before we get to the triumph, we have to look at why we fail. The source starts with a diagnosis of the human condition, and it identifies this universal impulse that seems to span every culture and every era.
What's that?
The impulse to check out, to withdraw.
The urge to hit the eject button on reality.
Exactly.
The source surveys the landscape of major world religions and identifies this recurring pattern. It's the philosophy of self-denial, the idea that the ego, or the nafs as it's called, is the villain of the story.
But isn't that the standard narrative? I mean, if I look at the history of religious thought, the self is almost always the bad guy. It's the source of greed, violence, selfishness. So isn't the impulse to suppress it actually a good thing?
That is precisely the assumption the source wants to challenge. But you're right. Let's look at the data first. The text breaks down how the self-denial manifests across different traditions.
Okay.
So take Christianity, for example. The source highlights the concept of submission of will. The whole narrative is that the carnal self, your biology, your drives, your instincts, is inherently flawed.
Maybe even sinful from birth.
Potentially. So to be saved, you have to die to the self. You hear that phrase all the time. You have to take up the cross. You have to renounce your own volition.
It's a total surrender. You're basically handing over the keys to the car because you don't trust yourself to drive.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And then the source looks at Judaism, specifically some of the mystical traditions like Kabbalah. It discusses a concept called Bitul Hayesh,
Which means
It translates roughly to the nullification of the ego.
nullification.
The logic is that God is infinite. If you are full of full of your own desires and opinions and ambitions, there's simply no room for the infinite.
So the ego is taking up space that belongs to God.
Exactly. It's seen as a form of idolatry. Your I becomes an idol. So the spiritual work is to make yourself smaller and smaller and smaller until you're just an empty vessel for the divine to flow through.
Okay, so in the West, we have surrender and nullification. Then you go east, and the source dives into Hinduism and Buddhism, and here the terminology gets even more specific about this idea of escape.
Oh, absolutely. In Hinduism, the central concept is moksha, liberation.
Yeah.
But you have to ask, liberation from
From life itself.
samsara, the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. The source argues that this worldview sees physical existence itself as a place of suffering. And the root cause of being stuck here is something called ahamkara.
The false ego, the belief that you are a separate individual self.
Yes, the illusion of individuality.
So the cure in that framework is to realize the individual is just a hallucination. The source talks about the classic metaphor, the drop of water falling into the ocean.
Right. Once the drop hits the ocean, the drop is gone. It ceases to be a drop.
It becomes the ocean.
And then Buddhism refines this even further with the concept of anatta, which literally means non-self. Nirvana isn't a paradise you go to.
It's not a place at all.
It's extinguishing, like blowing out a candle. You extinguish the fires of craving, of desire. If you stop wanting, you stop suffering. But to stop wanting, you have to dismantle the wanter.
You know, I see the appeal, though. As an empiricist looking at human psychology, life is hard. There's pain. There is loss. The idea of extinguishing the part of you that feels that pain, that is a very powerful sedative.
It is a sedative. And that is exactly the word the source would use. It critiques these philosophies as mechanisms for coping with a world that people don't understand or feel they can't control.
The source uses a metaphor here that I found really striking. It's the moth and the flame. It quotes a poem. The mystic cries, the self must die. The moth sees the light, which represents the divine or the truth, and it is so enamored by it that it flies directly into the flame and just incinerates itself.
That image captures the whole hermit silence philosophy perfectly. The moth achieves union with the light by ceasing to exist as a moth. And for centuries, this has been presented as the pinnacle of piety, of spiritual attainment.
And the source calls this out as a distortion.
A profound distortion.
But wait, why is it a distortion? This is what I want to get into. If the goal is closeness to the divine and the self is the barrier separating you, then burning up the self seems like the most logical solution. Why does the source have such a huge problem with the hermit?
Because the source argues that the entire premise is wrong. It claims the self is not a barrier, it's an instrument. The text offers a scathing critique of what it calls man-made religious hierarchies that peddle this kind of asceticism.
Okay.
It argues that a saying like earth is a heaven for the non-believers and hell for the believers is a lie.
That's a very common saying, though. I've heard that in multiple traditions. The idea that if you are suffering here, in this life, it means you're doing it right, and your reward is in the next life. It's delayed gratification.
The source calls that a waste of the intellect, a total waste. Think about the logic here from a rationalist perspective. If you genuinely believe this physical world is a trap or a hell for the believer, why would you ever study it?
You wouldn't.
Why would you learn physics? Why try to build a just society? Why bother trying to cure cancer if death is just the release from prison?
You wouldn't do any of it. You would just sit on the porch and wait for the bus to the afterlife.
That is the hermit's silence. It is an abdication of responsibility. The core argument in the text is this. If the Creator gave human beings this incredible, almost divine capacity for reason, for building, for connection, why would the instruction manual be, don't use any of this?
It's a contradiction.
The source argues that this asceticism is actually a form of deep ingratitude. You are rejecting the very tools you were given for the job.
So if we take the hermit's path, if we suppress the self, retreat to the cave, and just ignore the world, what is the cost? The source doesn't just say it's wrong, it suggests there's a real psychological penalty. It uses two words to diagnose this state.
Fear and grief.
Fear and grief. And it describes them not just as emotions, but as paralyzing agents.
Right. They're not just feelings, they're forces that stop you in your tracks.
Let's put on the empiricist hat for a moment and just look at the biology of that. Fear and grief. When you are in a state of chronic fear, your amygdala is hijacking your brain. You are in fight, flight, or freeze, and usually it's freeze.
The deer in the headlights.
Exactly. Your prefrontal cortex, the part of you that plans, that thinks rationally, that builds civilizations, it essentially goes offline. You cannot build a self, let alone a society, if you are psychologically paralyzed.
And that connects directly to the source's concept of shackles.
The shackles.
The text asks, why are we paralyzed?
Mhm.
Why is humanity so often stuck? And it answers with a phrase from the Quran, Surah Arad, shackles of their own making.
Shackles of their own making? That implies we're doing this to ourselves. It's not some external force.
We are forging them ourselves. The source then lists what these shackles are made of. And it's a powerful list.
What's on it?
Superstition, fatalism, the fear of death, subservience to tyrants, and the big one, the rejection of intellect, or akal as it's called.
I want to dig into superstition as a shackle. Because we usually think of superstition as just, silly, harmless beliefs. Don't walk under a ladder, throw salt over your shoulder.
Folk customs.
But the source frames it as something much, much more dangerous.
It frames it as a surrender of agency.
Yeah.
A complete surrender. Look, when you reject intellect, when you stop asking why and how the world works, you create a vacuum of explanation.
You don't know why it rained. You don't know why you got sick.
So you have to invent a reason. You say, it's magic, or it's an ancestor's curse, or it's the will of a local tyrant who has some kind of magical powers.
And the moment you do that, you are shackled. Because if the reason you got sick is magic, you can't cure it. You can't develop medicine. You can only beg the magician.
Right.
If the reason you are poor is just fate, then you can't work to change your circumstances. You can only endure it. You're a passenger.
That is the paralysis. The source notes that when people ignore the laws of the universe, they inevitably invent lies to fill that gap. They start to rely on intercessions, hoping someone else can save them so they don't have to do the work. Or they engage in blind imitation of their ancestors, doing things without knowing why just because it's always been done.
And that leads to this concept of the law of requital that the text mentions.
Yes, from Surah Yunus.
It talks about how these falsehoods, these lies, might provide a fleeting share. Can you break down that mechanism for us?
The law of requital is effectively Newton's third law applied to morality and sociology. For every action, there's a reaction. The fleeting share is the temporary comfort you get from a lie.
It's like a psychological painkiller.
Exactly. A superstition might make you feel safer for a moment. Bowing to a tyrant might get you a scrap of bread today. That is the fleeting share. But the source argues it lacks structural integrity. It has no foundation in reality.
It can't last.
It can't last because it's not real.
The text uses a powerful visual here. It says something like, those who attribute their lying inventions to God will see the crops of their false imagery burning to ashes. As an empiricist, I imagine a farmer. If a farmer ignores the laws of agriculture, if he plants rocks instead of seeds because a superstition told him to, he might feel good about it for a week. He has hope. That's his fleeting share. But when the harvest comes,
there is nothing there. The ash represents the collapse of a life or an entire society that's built on falsehood. Reality always wins eventually. The source is arguing that fear and grief are the direct symptoms of living in a reality distortion field. You are afraid because, deep down, you know your house is built on sand. You know the harvest isn't coming.
So the diagnosis is clear. We are paralyzed by fear because we have abandoned the intellect and chained ourselves with our own superstitions. Now, the source pivots, and this is where things get, pretty controversial.
Yes, they do.
Because the text suggests the cure isn't more religion, at least not in the traditional mystical sense. The cure is reason.
This is a massive pivot. It's where the ticking clockwork we talked about at the beginning comes back with a vengeance. The source explicitly states that the Quranic mandate is not mystery. It is not believe because I said so. It quotes Surah Yusuf. Resting my call upon reason.
Resting my call upon reason. I mean, that is a very different vibe from close your eyes and take a leap of faith.
It's the polar opposite. The source makes an incredibly bold claim here. Any teaching that demands the suspension of the intellect is, by definition, non-prophetic.
Say that in.
If you have to turn off your brain to believe it, it is not from the source of truth.
Okay, I have to stop you there, because this leads us directly to the section on hearsay. This is a big one. The source draws a very sharp line between the divine writ, meaning the Quran itself, and hadith, which are the traditions and narratives about the prophet.
Yes, it does.
And it basically says we should reject the latter if it conflicts with reason or the text itself. But hold on, hadith are the historical records. They provide context. Isn't the source just throwing the baby out with the bathwater here? If you toss out the entire historical tradition, aren't you just unmooring yourself from reality?
That is the friction point.
Hmm.
And it's where the rationalist lens is most critical. The source isn't arguing against history per se, it's arguing against hearsay as a primary source of religious law and doctrine.
Okay, that's the distinction.
It references another verse in Surah Yusuf, which states the revelation is a detailed explanation of everything, and explicitly says it is not a fabricated hadith or narrative.
But detailed explanation of everything, that's a huge claim. I mean, it obviously doesn't explain how to change a tire or the principles of quantum mechanics.
Of course, it must mean everything regarding guidance, morality, and the path to self-liberation.
Okay.
And the argument is about system integrity. Think of it like computer code. The divine writ in this view is the kernel, the core operating system. It is stable, protected, and internally consistent. Hadith, the source argues, are like user-created mods or patches passed around on an internet forum.
Some might be good.
Some might be helpful, but many are buggy, contradictory, or even malicious. They were reported by fallible human beings, transmitted through other fallible human beings over centuries.
And if you try to run your core system on dozens of conflicting patches,
You crash. You get the blue screen of death,
Mhm.
which in this case is psychological paralysis and social chaos. The source argues that hadith, being human reports, are inherently uncertain. They can contradict each other. One says do X, another says do Y.
this creates a fragmented mind.
How can you have certainty if your foundation is built on contradictory hearsay? You can't.
So liberation in this framework is defined as cleaning up the hard drive, deleting all the conflicting files and running only the core verified code.
Yes. The text posits that the Quran claims to be complete and sufficient for guidance. If it's complete, you don't need external supplements that confuse the issue. The divine writ provides the universal principles. Your intellect, quote, applies them to your specific situation. That is the formula for liberation.
So you clear out the clutter of hearsay, you reboot the operating system with the divine writ and reason. But the source doesn't just want you to sit in a library and read a book. It wants you to do something that seems, on the surface, completely unrelated to theology. It wants you to go outside and look at the sky.
The cosmic argument. This is where your empiricist lens comes in.
Yes, this is where the empiricist really wakes up. The source quotes Surah Arad. God is the one who raised the skies without pillars visible to you.
Which is a beautiful, poetic, and yet startlingly accurate description of gravity. An invisible pillar holding the entire structure together.
Exactly. And the text says the universe is not to be shunned. Remember the hermit in the cave trying to block it all out. The text says, no, look at it, study it. It calls the universe a laboratory.
A laboratory to be studied.
Yeah.
That completely reframes the act of science. Science isn't some secular distraction from God. It becomes a spiritual act. It's the act of decoding the Creator's signs, or ayat.
The source lists these signs in detail. The sun and the moon moving by exact calculation. The day and the night following each other in a precise sequence.
Order.
The mountains standing firm as stabilizers of the Earth's crust. The streams that flow, and then it gets into biology and botany.
Right, the diversity of tracks and fields, some growing grapes, some growing corn, all watered by the same water but yielding completely different tastes and textures.
Why the focus on botany and geology? What's the point it's making?
The point is order. The empiricist looks at that and sees a system governed by laws. The planets don't just randomly crash into each other because they follow the law of gravity. The stream flows downhill because it follows a law. There is no chaos in the heavens or in the processes of the earth. And here is the aha moment the source is driving at. This is the big connection. The same logic governing the stars governs the human soul.
That is the central thesis of the cosmic argument. The source implies that the internal world, the self, is not some magical, chaotic exception to the rules. It must align with these same immutable laws.
So just as there is a law of gravity,
There is a moral law, there's a psychological law.
if you ignore gravity and step off a cliff, you fall. You break your leg. Physics doesn't care if you are a good person or a bad person. It only cares if you respect the law of gravity.
And if you ignore the moral law, if you build your life on falsehood, if you are unjust, if you let fear dictate your actions, you crash psychologically and societally. The law of requital is just the law of gravity applied to the soul and to civilization. That makes the hermit look even more foolish. To deny the world to be the ascetic is to close your eyes to God's entire portfolio. It's like walking into the Louvre and blindfolding yourself to honor the artists. It's completely absurd.
It's worse than absurd. It's dangerous.
Mhm.
Because if you don't study the system, you can't navigate it. You remain a victim of it, tossed around by forces you refuse to understand.
This brings us to the central metaphor shift. The big one. We've talked about the moth, the one that dies in the flame, the suicidal mystic.
The symbol of the hermit's silence.
But the source introduces a powerful counter-metaphor from the poem included in the text. The Shaheen, the falcon.
The falcon. It's such a powerful image, the poem says. The timid moth that seeks the light and dies within the flame's pure white is not the Shaheen, the falcon's flight, that conquers skies with fearless might.
I just love that contrast. The moth approaches the light and dies. It's consumed. The falcon uses the light to see its prey. It uses the currents of the wind to soar. It doesn't surrender to the sky. It conquers it.
That is prophetic momentum. The prophet doesn't retreat from the world. He engages it. He changes it. The falcon is active. It is, you could say, predatory in the sense that it aggressively seeks its sustenance and its place in the cosmic hierarchy.
This completely reframes the concept of the self. The nafs. In the hermit's view, the nafs is a demon to be exorcised. In the falcon's view, the nafs is a trust, an amana.
A trust. That's a legal term. It's a fiduciary responsibility. If I give you a valuable asset in a trust, I'm not telling you to destroy it. That would be embezzlement.
You're supposed to manage it. You're supposed to grow it, make it productive.
You are its steward.
And this leads to the concept of kuti selfhood. The poem talks about forging the self into a sword of steel. You put the self in the fire of life, of struggle, of challenge, not to melt it away into nothing, but to temper it, to make it strong and sharp.
But this raises a really difficult question. If we aren't killing the ego, what do we do with the bad parts? I mean, we all have greed, we all have anger, jealousy. If I'm supposed to be a falcon, do I just let those impulses run wild? That sounds like sociopathy, not spirituality.
That's a valid fear. I mean, the Wolf of Wall Street is certainly a falcon in some sense, but he's not exactly a holy man.
Right. So how do we square that circle? That is where the crucial distinction between annihilation and purification, tazkiyah, becomes absolutely vital.
Tazkiyah.
That source clarifies that the Quranic goal is tazkiyah. The best analogy is to think of a gardener.
Okay, I'm picturing a gardener with some pruning shears.
If a gardener sees a beautiful rose bush that's growing wild with some dead branches and some ugly thorns, does he dig the whole thing up and burn it?
No, of course not. He prunes it.
He prunes it. He cuts back the dead wood. He removes the diseased leaves.
He cuts the wickedness, the corruption. But why? So that the healthy branches, the righteousness, can thrive, so they can get more sunlight. He wants more roses, not no roses. He wants the bush to be strong, structured, and productive.
That is a crucial nuance. The hermit wants to uproot the entire bush because it has thorns. The prophetic path accepts that the thorns are part of the plant's structure, but prunes them so the flower can bloom to its fullest potential.
The source backs this up with scripture, right?
It does. It quotes Surah Ash-Shams, which says the soul is inspired with both its wickedness and its righteousness. It's built in. It's part of the factory settings. Success isn't pretending the wickedness isn't there. It's proportioning it. It's about finding the right balance.
And how do you balance it? You can't do that in a vacuum. You can't learn to handle your anger if you never talk to anyone who makes you angry. You can't learn to control your greed if you never engage in business or commerce.
You do it by, and this is another heading from the source, living this life to the max.
Live this life to the max. It sounds like a Mountain Dew commercial from the 90s. But the source claims this is a core Quranic mandate.
It is. And it explicitly, forcefully rejects monasticism. It quotes Surah Al-Hadid, saying monasticism was something people invented for themselves, not something God prescribed. It's a human innovation, and according to the source, a bad one.
And then there's that amazing verse from Surah Al-Araf, who has forbidden the adornment of Allah.
Yes.
The empiricist in me just loves this because it validates sensory experience, it validates beauty, the varied fruits, the abundant yields. It's saying we're supposed to enjoy the good coffee, we are supposed to appreciate beautiful architecture, we are supposed to build healthy families and prosperous communities.
But, and this is the key difference between the falcon and the glutton, not for the sake of hedonism. The glutton consumes for momentary pleasure. The falcon consumes for fuel.
Fuel for what? What's the mission?
Fuel to serve. Fuel to establish justice. The source says, the earth is a bountiful training ground. You engage with commerce, with society, with struggle, because that is how you polish the mirror of the self. You can't polish a mirror in the dark of a cave.
So if you run an ethical business, that's a spiritual practice. If you raise difficult children with patience and wisdom, that's a spiritual practice.
Exactly. I mean, that is the logical conclusion from the text. You learn patience when you deal with a difficult customer, not when you sit alone in a room meditating. You learn justice when you have to divide a limited resource fairly among people who all want it, not when you own nothing and have no responsibilities.
The self is a muscle. It only grows under load.
And this world is the gymnasium,
That is the architecture of the self. It's built under load. It's a fortress, not a prison.
a fortress designed to protect and project values into the world.
So let's look at the destination. We've laid out the path. If we reject the hermit, ignore the superstitions, declutter our minds from hearsay, prune the ego instead of killing it, and engage the world, where do we end up? The Source calls it the supreme triumph.
The supreme triumph. In the source text, this is linked directly to the concept of the friends of God, or Awliya Allah.
Now, typically when I hear friend of God or saint, I think of someone who, floats 3 inches off the ground and speaks only in riddles, someone very detached from this world, ethereal.
Right, the classic image of the mystic. But the rationalist redefines this based on a passage in Surah Yunus. The text argues that the friends of God are not hermits. They are not ascetics in caves. They are those who live upright. And the specific term used is taqwa.
Taqwa. Okay, that's usually translated as fear of God, right? Which brings us full circle back to fear, which we said was a shackle. That seems like a contradiction.
It's a translation issue and a big one. The source frames taqwa not as terror or dread, but as moral rectitude and, more importantly, awareness of law.
Awareness of the law.
Yes. Think about driving on a busy highway. You don't fear the traffic laws in the sense that you are shaking with terror of the white lines. You are aware of them. You respect them because you know they keep you and everyone else safe. That respect, that awareness, is taqwa.
So a friend of God is someone who is hyper-aware of the laws of the universe, both the physical laws and the moral laws, and aligns their life with them.
Perfectly. And the direct result of this alignment is the absence of fear and grief.
We circle right back to the diagnosis. The cure for the paralysis is not a magical pill or a mystical experience. It's psychological security achieved in this world right now.
This is a radical idea. The supreme triumph isn't just about getting into heaven after you die. It is a state of mind that you can achieve right now. It is the mathematical result of alignment with reality.
I want you to say more about that mathematical result.
Think about it. If you are a structural engineer and you build a skyscraper strictly according to the laws of physics and the building code, do you fear that it will collapse when the wind blows?
No, I trust the structure. I can sleep soundly in the penthouse.
You have no fear. You have no grief over wasted materials or a failed project. You have supreme triumph, a state of peace and confidence born from being in harmony with immutable laws. The source is saying, build yourself and your society according to the divine laws, reason, justice, truth, and you will be immune to the fear and grief that plagues the rest of the world.
So heaven on earth isn't a fairy tale, it's a construction project.
It is, and it requires action. It requires work. The source emphasizes this over and over. It quotes Surah Al-Mulk, life is a test of best in deed. Not best in intention, not best in meditation, best in deed.
And Surah Al-Jumu'ah, I love this one. It says, essentially, when the prayer is finished, disperse within the land.
Don't just hang around the mosque all day. Go to work.
Go back to the marketplace. Go back to the lab. Go back to your family.
Disperse within the land and seek from the bounty of Allah. Go discover. Go invent. Go trade. The source is arguing that the self is developed through productive interaction, not through isolation.
It's a powerful synthesis. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground today. We started with the ticking clock and the flowing stream. We looked at the hermit's silence, the impulse to delete the self, and we saw how the source argues that leads to paralysis.
We analyze the shackles of fear, superstition, and hearsay, and how the rationalist approach requires us to break those chains using our intellect and the divine writ as our guide.
Then we looked through the empiricist vision. The universe as a laboratory, the signs in the stars and the soil, and the profound idea of aligning our internal order with the external order of the cosmos.
And finally, we arrived at prophetic momentum, the falcon, the active, engaged, pruned self that seeks not to escape the world, but to build a heaven on earth through justice and action.
The source is telling us that the Quranic life is about rejecting the false dichotomy between the spiritual and the secular. It's all one integrated system.
It's all one thing. To engage reason is a spiritual act. To establish justice is a spiritual act. To reject fabrication and demand evidence is a spiritual act.
The self isn't something to be ashamed of or destroyed. In this view, it's God's most perfect art.
And art is meant to be seen. It's meant to function in the world.
Before we sign off, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought, something to chew on. It comes from that poem in the source material. The desert blooms, the mountain bows, to one who holds his sacred vows.
That's a beautiful line. So much power in it.
It implies that the world itself, the desert, the mountain, responds to a fully realized, correctly built human being. So, here's the question for you, listening right now. If the self is a fortress you are building, what are you putting in the foundation today? Are you mixing the concrete with the weak water of superstition and fear?
Or are you reinforcing it with the steel of reason and action?
What are you building? And who are you building it for? A timid moth or a soaring falcon?
A lot to think about.
That's it for this deep dive. Go out there and disperse within the land.
Use your intellect. Build something strong.
We'll see you next time.